Why is it that love and conflict show up at the same time, the same place, so often? What is it about genuine, life-changing, transformative love that can bring with it resistance and distress and pain and suffering? Jesus' famous prayer for his disciples in John 17, today's gospel reading, struck me in a new way when I read it, how Jesus was so passionate and prayed to God so fervently for the love of God to be fully embodied in his disciples, and then immediately he begged God to keep them from becoming fractured and broken apart by conflict. He prayed as if he knew the risks of love. He knew something huge was at stake, as if the future of the kingdom of God hung in the balance. He prayed simultaneously for love and unity. He prayed that they would embody in their flesh the very love of God, and he prayed that they would find a way through the resistance that love would inevitably bring along with it. Think about it. Isn't it remarkable that Jesus had a universal reputation for being loving, yet the powers that be were so threatened by him that they executed him? Here's a thought I want to test with you. Tell me what you think. I suggest the reason that love and conflict go together so often is that love, by definition, extends freedom to the other. And freedom often offends someone. Now, freedom is essential to love. The objects of our love cannot also be the objects of our control. Love and coercive power do not mix. If we say we love someone, we must also say we release them to become all they were created to be. We free them. I'm not saying that we free toddlers to run across a busy road at will. I'm saying that if the one we love is capable of safely making their own decisions, we let them. Even while we remain loyal and committed and connected to them. But the fact is that loving people in that way, extending freedom in that way, can bring about conflict. Often when someone cashes in on their freedom, someone else seems to pay for it. Sometimes freedom rocks the boat. It creates imbalance, disequilibrium. It disturbs the status quo. When somebody is given freedom, there's often someone else invested in that person not being free to become different than they were before they were granted freedom. Think about all the people that Jesus showed love to by extending some freedom to them that they didn't have before. He allowed women to accompany him, to talk to him, even touch him. He let children climb up on his lap. He let Gentiles engage him as equals. He let lepers approach him, and he even touched them. He let tax collectors and sinners be his host and feed him dinner. that rocked the boat. Every time he showed love to someone by extending freedom, someone else pushed back hard. First century Palestinian Jewish social order and the powers that maintained that order needed for all those people that Jesus touched to know where they belonged in the social order and stay there. It threatened the powers and threatened stability for Jesus to show those people the door to freedom. And clearly, this is what is going on in today's dramatic story from the book of Acts. As the apostles start spreading the Jesus movement, start taking the Jesus way seriously, and start behaving toward other people the way Jesus did. This is a story about a slave girl who was shown love and thus freedom. In fact, she was freed twice in one single act of deliverance. An act of God carried out by Paul and Silas and the other apostles. She was freed from an oppressive spirit that held her captive, and she was freed from human exploitation in one fell swoop. But ironically, her owners remained captive. They were captive in a different way. They were captive to greed, captive to a desire to control others, and thereby captive to anxiety about maintaining control, since their economic livelihood was based on their ability to keep exploiting this young girl. So captive were they that the healing and freeing of one young slave girl could completely unhinge them. Paul and Silas, two simple, unarmed, itinerant preachers, were so threatening to them that they concocted a story to get them arrested. Said they were disturbing the whole city. In truth, maybe they were disturbing the whole city. They were preaching a gospel of love and freedom. They were preaching resurrection. They were pulling together a community of people who dared to publicly live out the gospel of resurrection, dared to fully live as a human being in the way God intended them to live. Resurrection can be pretty threatening to the powers that deal in death. When salvation is created, as the choir sang, in the midst of the earth, not as an escape from this broken earth, but salvation is created in the midst of the earth. Salvation can be deeply distressing to forces that depend on maintaining the status quo on this earth. Resurrection causes people to turn and go a different way. I can see why those in control might have been threatened and reactive. So Paul and Silas get thrown into prison after a severe beating. The powers of that town, so captive were they to fear and anxiety, they lock up Paul and Silas and put them in iron shackles because they gave a powerless and oppressed girl her freedom. Pretty twisted, huh? And it happens all the time. And everywhere. Still. Think of all the people in our country who have been fined or jailed or slapped with felonies in recent years because they did something to show compassion to undocumented immigrants. Right now, in fact, powers that be are coming down hard on a nonprofit group called No More Deaths, whose volunteers leave large stashes of drinking water in the Arizona desert along the border. Moved by love and compassion for human beings, these people could not stand idly by while human remains of over 3,000 border crossers who died of starvation, of dehydration in the desert, have already been collected by the Arizona medical examiner. You may know that Border Patrol agents have been filmed destroying or emptying those water jars in the desert where they find them. And if you're following the news right now, you know that one of this No More Deaths volunteers is on federal trial facing felony charges for giving aid and shelter to 2 undocumented persons. His charges could land him in prison for 20 years. Now, regardless of what you think about that particular group, No More Deaths, or no matter what your view of immigration policy, I think we can all agree that this is a prime example of love meeting resistance. Some people's hearts were moved when thousands were dying, so they took action, and the social order is suddenly threatened. Some people will argue that it's a just social order and that we are protecting a good status quo, but we can all see the boat is being rocked. There are many people, including ordinary citizens like you and I, who believe that their comfort and security is being impinged on by someone else's freedom. So love meets resistance. I don't know how else to describe these things. I think it's wise when we hear about these kinds of things and others like them to consider how Jesus might have responded, or how Paul and Silas might have responded. It's not just these big news-making cases that bring this whole issue to bear on us. We live it daily. We are personally threatened when we miss out on something that somebody else got who we think didn't deserve it. It's fine if someone else gets a little freedom until it impinges on my freedom, or until it costs me something that I think I deserve, or until that freedom in some way offends my sense of morality and justice. This is kind of like the sin of envy in our sermon series on the deadly sins this past winter. Envy cannot rejoice when someone else comes into possession of something good, get some gift, be that freedom or favor of some other kind. The sin of envy has caught in its death grip all kinds of people in the Bible. It caused Cain to kill Abel. It caused Esau and Jacob to be estranged, and Rachel and Leah to be in conflict with each other, and a band of brothers to sell one of their own, Joseph, into slavery. And it continues to this day in many ways, large and small. So when we rightly judge the owners of this slave girl in Acts for their abuse and injustice, we also do well to step back a bit and look at the larger picture. They reacted in that way in order to protect their investment. Don't we do the same thing? On a smaller scale? Daily? No, not to the extreme of human trafficking, thank God. But our sin and theirs is on a spectrum. the love and freedom someone else receives can easily become an occasion for my taking offense. Like in the children's story, how Johnny took offense at Gabe's being welcomed. So rather than jump on our high horse and declare judgment against the villains in that story in Acts, we could make this into an opportunity for some serious soul searching. We could ask ourselves, whose freedom irks us? And what would it look like for us to extend love and compassion instead of resistance? Do we see someone getting a pass on some behavior or lifestyle we find objectionable? Or do we notice someone or a whole group or class of people who are coming into some favor or newfound power or public esteem who did nothing to deserve it, at least not deserve it as much as we do, righteous persons that we are? I wonder if these kind of soul-searching questions might do us as a church a lot of good in the times in which we live now and in being honest about our history. Think of all the gifted and strong women leaders in the church, the resistance that they had to endure over the years, and many still do, as they found new freedom to lead and use their gifts. And I wonder if, as the presidential election season heats up with Democrats and Republicans constantly going at each other's throats, and with many of our neighbors and co-workers joining in, and things getting uglier and uglier by the week, whether we can step back and look at our neighbors with eyes of love instead of judgment. Whether we can look at people in our own congregation and family the same way and see in them a desire to find meaning and belonging and stability, the same things that we're looking for. Can we pledge to engage each other in mutual trust and love, and rejoice with others in whatever freedom they are discovering, even if we see things in a different light, even in a different moral light? What if those who controlled the life of that slave girl in Acts had actually noticed her humanity instead of seeing her merely as an object, a resource, a means to an end? That story would have unfolded much differently. And what if we saw every human being in that same light? Every human being. Even those we vigorously disagree with, even those whose life or language we cannot understand, even our political opposites, even those whose theology we consider heresy. What if our first reaction, not necessarily our only eventual thoughtful response, but our first reaction was to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep? What if our knee-jerk Christian reaction, informed by the unconditional love of Jesus, was to celebrate someone's new freedom from whatever oppressed them? Yes, an oppressed person's freedom will nearly always rock somebody's boat. It will nearly always interject some complexity into the situation. Something might need to shift. When a new passenger boards a crowded bus, everyone adjusts a little. What if we all agree to address that complexity eventually in an honest and open and loving conversation, but only after we have rejoiced in their liberation from bondage? I just wonder how our world and how our church might be different than what it is. The desire of God in Christ, as lived out and demonstrated by Jesus, is always freedom from oppression. Accountability? Yes. Moral demands? Of course. But the yoke offered by Jesus is an easy yoke, and its burden is light, and we should rejoice in that. And we are all invited to come and take on that yoke and rest, along with all the others doing the same thing. Let's sing together. Sing the story, number 48, Come Unto Me.